Let me take you on a journey of complexity, emotion, and the intricate dance between love, betrayal, and regret. This tale revolves around power, manipulation, and the sharp sting of realization, where actions taken in the heat of the moment lead to consequences far more profound than anyone could have foreseen. The affair of ambition and regret. In the glistening heights of a bustling metropolis, there was a man named Gregory Ward, a seasoned CEO of an esteemed tech firm. His empire, built over decades, was a symbol of success, power, and ambition. But behind his polished facade was a man who had lost touch with the very essence of human connection. Ambition had consumed him, leaving a trail of emotional neglect in his wake. At the heart of this empire was a brilliant woman named Clara Hayes. She was his most trusted assistant, not just because of her sharp mind, but because she had an innate ability to read the room, to anticipate Gregory's every move. Her intellect, though, was a double-edged sword. While Gregory appreciated it professionally, it was her quiet beauty and the vulnerability that hid beneath her carefully curated exterior that drew him closer. For years, Clara worked tirelessly, her every decision, every step designed to propel Gregory's vision forward. They shared late nights in the office, discussing strategy and overcoming obstacles, and in those moments their connection deepened, though neither dared to name it. Clara's marriage to a distant, emotionally absent husband had left her longing for something real, something more than the hollow promises and unsaid words that passed between them. She had yearned for someone who could make her feel seen, heard, alive. Gregory, unaware of the emotional void in her life, merely saw an assistant, an invaluable asset to his empire, someone to keep his business flourishing. It started innocently. Enough, a lunch here, a drink there, as they celebrated yet another business victory. But as their bond grew, so did the forbidden attraction between them. One night, when the weight of their work and their mutual unspoken desires became too much to bear, they crossed the line. The affair, born out of lust, power, and fleeting moments of emotional vulnerability, was brief but intense. But as quickly as it began, the affair faded. Gregory, like many before him, returned to his world of power and ambition, and Clara, though she felt the sting of betrayal more acutely than ever, returned to her family, torn between guilt and desire. Yet for Gregory, it was not so simple. As the weeks passed, his mind wandered back to Clara, to the tenderness in her eyes, to the intelligence and warmth she had offered him during their stolen moments. He had no idea what it was about her that had stayed with him, but he began to feel something deep within, a regret that gnawed at him, sharp and unsettling. He had used her, yes, but in doing so, he had lost something vital, something he hadn't even realized he had been searching for. In the cool silence of his office, he replayed the moments they had shared. Her laughter in the midst of stress, her wisdom that cut through his bravado, her quiet strength that had always balanced his ego. Gregory had cheated with Clara, yes, but he had also cheated himself out of understanding the depth of the person she truly was, and the connection they could have had he been brave enough to truly see her. The affair was a turning point for him, one he did not understand until much later. His marriage, once a symbol of stability, was crumbling under the weight of his own emotional neglect. His relationship with his wife, once founded on affection and companionship, had become transactional. His regret was not just for his affair with Clara, it was for the life he had lost in pursuit of success, for the person he had become. But Clara, she had returned to her life, scarred by the betrayal, and overwhelmed with guilt. Her relationship with her husband had grown more distant than ever, but she could never bring herself to leave him. Her love for Gregory, though real, had been tainted by the knowledge of what had transpired. She had longed for something more. But she had also learned a valuable lesson. Love, like success, required sacrifice, but it must be a sacrifice rooted in respect, not in manipulation or power plays. As the months passed, Gregory tried to reach out to Clara, sending messages, offering apologies, trying to recapture something he could never regain. But Clara, though tempted, knew the truth. She had given a piece of herself to him, and though it was flattering to know he regretted his actions, the cost of that piece was far greater than any moment of fleeting pleasure they had shared. The final chapter of their story was not written in the grand gestures of reconciliation, but in the quiet understanding between them. Gregory learned that ambition without empathy could never bring true fulfillment. As the months slipped by, both Gregory and Clara found themselves entrenched in the aftermath of their actions. Gregory, despite his regret, was still caught in the grip of his own empire. His heart ached at the thought of Clara, but his pride and the cold calculations of business kept him from pursuing her any further. He remained distracted, always moving forward, never fully acknowledging the toll his choices had taken on him. Meanwhile, Clara, though deeply scarred, began to change. Her marriage, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a cage. Her husband, Richard, had grown indifferent to her needs, and Clara realized that her own heart had become a battleground between two men, one who had betrayed her and the other who had ignored her for years. But it wasn't until one fateful evening, when she saw the flicker of a text message on Richard's phone, that the true realization struck. She had never suspected her husband of infidelity. He had always been distant, yes, but never unfaithful. But the message she read, though casual, was enough. A flirtatious exchange, a secret meeting arranged, a betrayal of a different kind. Clara was no longer the passive woman she once was. The hurt, the anger, the powerlessness she had felt in her marriage and in the affair with Gregory had turned into something more potent: revenge. Her mind, which had once been consumed with guilt and sorrow, now sharpened with clarity. She no longer cared for apologies. She didn't need closure. She would take control of the narrative that had been stolen from her. She would become the author of her own story. And so, she set her plan into motion. The web of deceit. The first move was to confront Richard, not with accusations, but with a quiet, calculated betrayal of her own. She never let on that she had read the message. Instead, she began to subtly shift in her behavior. Clara started distancing herself, becoming colder, more elusive. Richard, accustomed to her quiet nature, noticed the change but didn't understand its source. He assumed it was a phase. After all, hadn't he been distant too? But Clara knew exactly what she was doing. She began to plant seeds of doubt in his mind, making him question his own loyalty. She would leave late for meetings, return late, at night, and always have an excuse, a reason for why she was unavailable. She knew how much his pride mattered to him, how much he valued his control over their shared life. She began to break him down, little by little, making him feel as if he were the one betraying her, even as she did the same to him. And then there was Gregory. Clara's plan didn't stop with Richard. She had her eyes on Gregory, the man who had once held her heart in his hands, only to crush it without a second thought. He had regretted their affair, but regret had never truly been an apology. Clara had been used, manipulated in the name of power and ambition, and she had suffered for it. But now she would turn the tables. She would make him regret his actions, more deeply than he could ever imagine. The way she would do this was simple. Gregory, a man who had carefully constructed a fortress of success around him, would soon find himself on the receiving end of an unanticipated betrayal. Clara knew that his reputation was his greatest asset. His image was carefully cultivated, and any crack in that armor could shatter him. And so she started her campaign, a series of anonymous letters, cryptic emails, and whispered rumors that suggested something far darker than an affair between them. She painted their relationship as one of manipulation, of power plays, of deceit. Each message was designed to stir doubt in Gregory's mind, to erode his foundation. At first it was subtle, small, ambiguous details that could easily be dismissed. But soon, the insinuations grew bolder, more direct. She spread rumors that she had recorded their private conversations, painting their affair as one of coercion. She hinted at the possibility that their relationship had been much more than a fleeting romance, suggesting that Clara had once been his willing accomplice in business schemes, or worse, that he had used their relationship to gain leverage over competitors. Gregory's world began to unravel in ways he couldn't comprehend. People he trusted began to pull away from him, his colleagues questioning his motives, his personal life becoming the subject of gossip. Clara knew that eventually the web she had spun would entangle him in a scandal he could never recover from. But the final stroke of her revenge was a face-to-face encounter with Gregory himself. One late evening, when the world was quiet, Clara found herself standing before the man who had betrayed her. They met in the shadow of their past, silent, heavy, and charged with a tension that neither had dared confront before. Gregory, visibly shaken, could not mask the guilt in his eyes as he looked at her. Clara had become a stranger to him, a woman he could no longer manipulate with charm or authority. She was no longer the vulnerable assistant. She was the architect of her own power. "Clara," Gregory whispered, but she cut him off. "You thought you were the only one capable of manipulating the game, Gregory," she said, her voice steady, calm. "You never considered that the pieces you moved could one day move themselves." He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in, and for the first time, Gregory understood what it was like to be powerless, to be on the receiving end of a betrayal that was no longer his to control. With that final exchange, Clara walked away. She had succeeded. She had taken back the power that had been stolen from her, not through violence or vengeance, but through a calculated, perfect execution of her own will. The story continued to unfold, weaving itself deeper into the fabric of betrayal and the complex dance of revenge. Clara's plan, though devastating, was far from over. It had only been the beginning, for her hunger for justice, or perhaps retribution, had not yet been fully satisfied. The walls she had carefully constructed around her emotions had crumbled, but now she needed to ensure that the foundations of Gregory and Richard's worlds would be irrevocably destroyed. She had already driven a wedge between Gregory and the trust of his colleagues, his own sense of security shattered. Now, it was time to set her sights on Richard, the man who had made her feel invisible for years, the one who had promised her forever but failed to see her needs, her desires, her very soul. The moment Clara had uncovered his betrayal, she had known that no forgiveness would come. Not from her, and certainly not from the universe. Richard, for all his faults, had once been her anchor. He had been her partner, her confidant, the man with whom she had once dreamed of a future. But now, he was no more than another pawn in her carefully designed game, and it was time to checkmate. The echo of betrayal Richard had begun to notice, the changes in Clara, the distance in her gaze, the coldness in her touch, the silence that had begun to fill their once warm home. He could not place the cause, but his guilty conscience began to claw at him. The texts and messages had stopped being innocent, and the guilty looks had become more pronounced. Yet he chose to ignore the signs, as he had for so long. One evening, as he returned from a late meeting, he found Clara waiting in their living room, her eyes darker than he had ever seen them before. She wasn't the same woman who had once cooked dinner for him with a smile. This Clara was a stranger, a woman transformed by something darker, something more powerful than love. "Clara, what's going on?" Richard asked, his voice tight with concern, but Clara's eyes burned with an icy fury. "You don't need to ask me that, Richard. she said softly, her words cutting through the tension between them like a blade. You've known for a long time. Richard's confusion deepened, but Clara wasn't interested in explanations anymore. Instead, she had something far more potent to offer him: revenge. With a cold smile, Clara handed him a folder. He opened it, only to find the evidence she had gathered: emails, photos, and details of his affair with a younger colleague from his office. The affair wasn't a fling, it was a carefully built relationship that had lasted for months. Clara had known it would be there, and now the proof lay in front of him, undeniable. Richard's blood ran cold. He had never expected Clara to find out. It wasn't that he didn't care, no. It was that he had underestimated her. He had thought she was too passive, too soft, to ever see through his lies. He had been wrong. "You think this is over, don't you?" Clara continued, her voice low and calm. "That I'll forgive you, that I'll pretend it didn't happen, like I've always done?" Richard's mouth went dry. "Clara, please. It was a mistake. I never meant for you to find out. I swear I love you. But Clara cut him off with a single sharp motion of her hand. "I'm not here for apologies, Richard. I'm here for justice. You will never again take me for granted. Not ever again." She stood up and walked toward the door, leaving Richard standing frozen, the weight of his own guilt crashing down on him. As she reached for the doorknob, she turned back and gave him one last look. "I hope your affair was worth it," she said coldly, "because it will cost you more than you could ever imagine." With that, she stepped out of the house, leaving Richard to stew in his own shame and regret. But Clara knew that this confrontation, though it had wounded him, was not enough. No, she had much more in store for him. The final act of revenge. For Clara, the final act of revenge was not only about unmasking her husband's betrayal, but about taking control of her own future, of ensuring that her own power was never again compromised. She had learned from her past mistakes. Now she was no longer the victim, she was the victor. The rumors she had planted about Gregory began to spread like wildfire, but this time, it wasn't just the business world that was whispering about him. It was the very core of his personal life. Clara had learned the art of precision. Her messages and letters were now meticulously designed to hit Gregory where it would hurt the most. She had leaked information not just about their affair, but about his many business dealings, his manipulative tactics, and the questionable ethics of his empire. People began questioning the integrity of the company he had spent decades building. As Gregory's empire began to crumble, his personal life followed suit. The story of Clara's revenge continued to unfold like the pages of a dark novel, each chapter more intense, more complicated than the last. Her power had been reclaimed, but the echoes of her past, the betrayals, the manipulation, the heartbreak, lingered. Her actions had caused irreparable damage to Gregory and Richard, but deep down, Clara knew that the ultimate satisfaction wasn't in their downfall. It was in her own transformation. But revenge, like a tempest, never truly ends. It shifts and churns, leaving behind more wreckage than one ever anticipates. Clara had made her mark, but there was one last piece to the puzzle. A piece that she hadn't fully understood at the time, a piece that would complete her journey and prove to herself just how far she was willing to go. The return of the shadow. Months after her final confrontation with Richard, Clara had begun to rebuild her life. She had sold the house they once shared and moved to a quieter part of the city, where the world seemed less sharp, less cruel. She focused on her work, her personal growth, her health. The woman who had once felt lost, diminished by the weight of betrayal, was now a woman who stood tall and unapologetically strong. But Gregory was a ghost that continued to haunt her thoughts. He had been left broken, his empire crumbling under the pressure of the scandals she had meticulously orchestrated. His company, once the beacon of his identity, was now a hollow shell, dismantled by his own greed and pride. Yet Gregory had not vanished. He had receded into the shadows, licking his wounds, but Clara knew him too well. He wouldn't remain passive forever. There was a part of him, egotistical, desperate, that would seek retribution. He would not let her win without a final battle. One evening, just as Clara was about to close her apartment door, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was an encrypted email from an unknown sender, but Clara could already guess who it was. Her stomach tightened as she opened the message. "You think you've won, Clara, but your victory was a mirage. You don't know what I'm capable of. I'll be back, and when I am, you'll regret underestimating me." The words burned on the screen, a threat cloaked in bravado. Gregory, it seemed, had found a way to fight back. Begins again. Clara's heart beat a little faster as the weight of the message settled in. She had expected Gregory to eventually seek revenge, but she had hoped that his downfall would be enough to break him. Instead, she realized that his ego was too big to accept defeat. He would come after her, perhaps in ways she couldn't predict. But one thing was certain. She wasn't the same woman she had been when they first crossed paths. This time, she would be prepared. Her first move was to secure her privacy. Clara had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She hired security experts, ensured that her personal and professional lives were kept separate, and made certain that every step she took was calculated. But Gregory's retaliation wasn't immediate. He, too, knew the game he was playing. He waited, observed, and plotted. For weeks, Clara went about her life, watching for any signs that he was closing in. But there was nothing, not a word, not a shadow. It seemed that Gregory was biding his time. Then, one evening, it happened. Clara was invited to a gala, a charity event for the city's elite, an affair she had planned to attend in support of a cause she cared about. But as she entered the grand ballroom, her eyes scanned the crowd, and there he was, Gregory, standing across the room, staring at her with those same calculating eyes. His presence sent a chill down her spine. He had returned, not with fury, but with something far more dangerous: control. He approached her slowly, his footsteps measured, his expression unreadable. Clara, though outwardly calm, felt a flash of old anxiety, a fear she hadn't experienced in months. She had grown accustomed to being in control, but here, in the presence of the man who had once held so much power over her, that control slipped away like sand through her fingers. "Clara," Gregory said, his voice smooth, but edged with an underlying tension. "I didn't expect you to be here tonight." "Neither did I," she replied coolly, masking the slight tremor in her voice. "But it seems you've made a habit of showing up when least expected." Gregory smirked, but there was something different in his demeanor. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? That you've won because I've been silent. But I've learned something over the last few months. I've learned how to play this game better than anyone." Clara's gaze hardened. "You may have played me before, but you're not playing me now, Gregory. If you think I'm afraid of you, you're mistaken." His smirk faded. "I'm not here to intimidate you, Clara." The conclusion of Clara's revenge was nothing short of monumental, but it was in the quiet aftermath where the true nature of her transformation became evident. The bitter taste of betrayal had long since dissolved into something more profound, more liberating. She had not only reclaimed her power from the wreckage of her past, but had reshaped her future entirely. However, the remnants of the past were never truly gone. Even in the moments of peace that followed, there lingered a sense of unfinished business, unanswered questions, unexplored emotions. Revenge had been her fuel, but it had also been a reflection of her pain. Now, Clara was faced with the question, what next? The price of victory months passed, and Clara's life began to settle into a new rhythm. She had distanced herself from the people who had betrayed her, creating an empire of her own, not of wealth or business, but of strength, independence, and peace. Yet there was still a hollow, an unspoken tension that crept into her thoughts when she least expected it. Gregory had disappeared completely from the public eye. His name, once synonymous with power and influence, had become a ghost. His company dissolved, his assets liquidated, and his connections severed. All that was left were whispers in boardrooms, and the occasional hushed conversation about a man who had once been feared and admired, now reduced to a cautionary tale. As for Richard, he had been forced to endure the consequences of his infidelity, a slow, agonizing unraveling of his life. Though Clara had left him with nothing but his guilt, his actions weighed heavily on her heart, though she tried not to dwell on them. But despite the triumphs of her revenge, something tugged at her, a gnawing feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, she had overlooked a deeper layer of the betrayal that had consumed her life. There was no one left to confront, no one left to hold accountable, at least no one but herself. The heart of betrayal. One quiet evening, as Clara sat alone in the peaceful solitude of her apartment, a knock echoed through the door. The sound was unexpected, and for a moment she hesitated. It wasn't often that someone came to her unannounced. She rose to her feet, walking toward the door with a steady hand, her mind already running through possible scenarios. When she opened it, standing before her was someone she had not seen in months. Detective Elias Carrington. He had been the one who had helped her uncover some of the darker secrets behind Gregory's business dealings, but he had also been the one who had helped her piece together the evidence that had ultimately destroyed her marriage with Richard. "Detective," she said, her voice cool but tinged with curiosity. "What brings you here?" Elias, dressed in a dark coat with a somber expression, looked past her and into the apartment. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a weight that made Clara feel uneasy. "I need to talk to you, Clara, about something I should have told you long ago." Clara's heart skipped a beat. What could he possibly have to say to her? He had been instrumental in exposing the truths behind Gregory's betrayal, but this felt different. Elias stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and Clara closed the door behind him. "I've been keeping an eye on some loose ends," Elias began, his voice serious. "And it turns out there's more to Gregory's fall than you." "No." Clara's pulse quickened, but she held her composure. "What do you mean?" "Gregory wasn't working alone, Clara. There were people behind the scenes, high-level connections, powerful allies who helped him maintain his control, people who are just as ruthless as he was, and they're not happy with how things have turned out for him." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying? That he's coming back? That his downfall was just a temporary setback?" "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "What I'm saying is that you might not be finished yet. You've taken down Gregory, but his associates have been watching you, and now they want revenge." Clara's mind raced. She had thought she had removed every trace of her past, but she had been wrong. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked, frustration lacing her voice. "I thought you were on my side." Elias's eyes softened with a hint of regret. "I should have, Clara. I didn't realize the depth of it until after Gregory disappeared. But the more I dug, the more I uncovered. His business partners, his allies, they're still out there. And they want to make sure that you understand that no one gets to take down their empire without consequences." A new battle. The weight of Elias's words lingered in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Clara felt the familiar chill of fear creeping up her spine. But there was something else now. A sense of empowerment, the knowledge that she had already survived one betrayal and come out stronger. The days that followed Elias's warning were filled with tension, but Clara wasn't a woman who allowed fear to consume her. She had already been through the fire, betrayed by those she loved, stripped of everything she thought she knew, and then rebuilt from the ground up. The remnants of that former life were now like old scars, faint, barely visible, but still there, reminders of what she had overcome. However, this time, the stakes were higher. The shadows that had once loomed over her were now real, tangible, threats. Clara had never been one to shy away from danger, but there was something different about this new threat. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a battle against a hidden network of power, of men and women who thrived in the dark corners of the world where betrayal was not only expected, but necessary. The gathering storm. Clara spent the next few weeks gathering information, working with Elias to understand the web of connections that Gregory had left behind. They discovered that his fall wasn't just about bad business decisions or a tarnished reputation. There were people who had relied on Gregory's success, investors with deep pockets, ruthless financiers, and even corrupt politicians who had turned a blind eye to his dealings as long as the money flowed. But Clara wasn't just fighting faceless entities. She was fighting people who knew how to pull strings, how to move in silence, how to manipulate the system to their advantage. Yet Clara had learned from the best. She had learned from Gregory, from Richard, from the very people who had betrayed her. The one thing they never understood was Clara's resilience. They never saw the fire burning inside her, a fire that had been sparked by years of manipulation and now was raging as a blaze of defiance. "Elias, how many of them are there?" Clara asked one evening, poring over documents that listed names, companies, and accounts she had never seen before. The depth of Gregory's connections was staggering, but she had no intention of being overwhelmed. "At least a dozen key players. But there are more we haven't identified yet," Elias replied, his brow furrowed as he skimmed through a stack of confidential files. "They're spread across different industries, but they all have one thing in common. They need Gregory's downfall to be corrected, and they need you out of the picture." Clara exhaled slowly, her mind turning over the plan that had begun to form. She had no intention of running, she never had. If they thought they could intimidate her, she would show them just how wrong they were. "They won't see us coming," she said quietly. Her words weren't a question, but a declaration. A game of shadows. In the following days, Clara and Elias became like two chess players, each anticipating the other's next move. Clara understood the rules of the game now: strategy, patience, and precision. She couldn't afford to play recklessly. If she was going to survive this, she had to outsmart them, use their own tactics against them. Every word spoken, every action taken, was part of a larger plan. Elias had introduced her to a few trusted allies, private investigators, hackers, and former law enforcement officers who had worked on cases similar to hers. Together, they began to map out Gregory's network, targeting those who might be most vulnerable to manipulation. There were key players they had to neutralize, people who had the power to influence both public opinion and the legal system. Clara's first target was someone she had no personal history with, but whose actions had been pivotal in making Gregory's business empire thrive. Harlan Avery, a ruthless financier who had secretly funded much of Gregory's illicit deals. Harlan was a man who understood power, who thrived on control. He was also vulnerable, a man with too many secrets that he could never afford to let slip. Clara knew exactly how to exploit his weakness. A cold encounter. Harlan Avery was a shadowy figure in the world of finance, known for his ability to move vast sums of money around the globe without leaving a trace. He didn't trust anyone, not even his own associates, which made him difficult to manipulate. But Clara had learned something crucial. Everyone has a price. And Harlan, despite his cold exterior, was no exception. Elias had arranged a meeting with Harlan at a discreet location, a high-end restaurant on the outskirts of the city, where business deals were made in silence, away from prying eyes. Clara arrived early, as planned, dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, her demeanor calm yet unwavering. She needed to present herself as unassuming, someone Harlan would underestimate. When Harlan arrived, he didn't look at Clara with surprise. He had likely been briefed by someone from Gregory's circle, but he certainly didn't expect the game that she was about to play. "Ms. Whitmore," Harlan greeted her, his voice clipped, his gaze cold. Clara stood at the edge of the window, the city lights casting a warm glow against the dark sky, but her thoughts were far from serene. The echo of the past still haunted her, a past that had once been marked by betrayal, and now, it seemed, that same cruel cycle was repeating itself. Her husband, Richard, whom she had tried so hard to rebuild a life with after the painful wreckage of their first betrayal, was once again the source of her turmoil. A familiar betrayal. For years, Clara had carried the scars of Richard's first affair, and though she had sworn to herself that she would never again allow herself to be blindsided, the signs were undeniable. The late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the fleeting moments where his gaze no longer met hers with the same warmth, the same trust they had once shared. There was a coldness between them now, a distance that she could not ignore. The whispers had started subtly at first. A distant cousin had mentioned something about seeing Richard out with a woman who wasn't Clara, and though she had tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, the seed of doubt had been planted. Now Clara had caught him, again. The evidence wasn't subtle this time. Richard had left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, his text messages flashing on the screen as if taunting her. The messages were direct and clear, the intimacy dripping from every word from someone she didn't recognize. Sophie, the name that appeared again and again, sent shivers down Clara's spine. It wasn't just an affair. It was a full-fledged betrayal of the trust they had painstakingly rebuilt. But Clara wasn't the type to confront recklessly. She had learned over the years that rage was a dangerous weapon, but a woman scorned could be far more lethal when armed with patience and precision. She had lived through the sting of betrayal before, and now she had a plan. The return of the mistress. Clara knew she needed to confront Richard, but not just yet. First, she would meet Sophie, the woman who had thought she could come into Clara's life and tear it apart. Sophie had no idea who Clara really was, or rather who she had become. She had underestimated the power of a woman who had already been tested by fire. Through her network of connections, Clara tracked down Sophie's location, finding her at a chic cafe on the other side of town. It was there that Clara would make her presence known, not with an accusation, but with the quiet power of undeniable authority. The cafe was quiet when Clara arrived, the soft hum of conversations and the clink of coffee cups providing an almost peaceful atmosphere. Sophie was seated by the window, her back to the door, completely unaware of Clara's approach. Clara's heart didn't race as it might have in the past. She had already made her peace with this moment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was hers, about making sure Sophie understood that Clara was no one's fool. Clara walked up to the table with deliberate steps, her heels clicking against the floor. She paused just behind Sophie, waiting for the moment to hit. And then, when Sophie turned around and saw Clara standing there, her face drained of color, Clara spoke. "I thought I should introduce myself," Clara said coolly. "I'm Clara Whitmore, and you're the woman who's been sleeping with my husband." Sophie froze, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the words, but none came. Clara didn't wait for an apology or a justification. She wasn't interested in what Sophie had to say. No, Clara was in control here. "I know everything, Sophie, and I'm giving you a choice," Clara continued, her voice steady, though the intensity of her words could have shattered glass. You can walk away from this, from Richard, and from my life. Or I can make sure you never forget this moment, for as long as you live. Sophie's eyes darted around, her pulse visibly quickening. But Clara wasn't done. She leaned in just enough to ensure Sophie could hear every word, her breath cold and calculating. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Clara whispered, her lips curling into a faint, dangerous smile. I'm the woman who has survived the worst betrayal imaginable. I've rebuilt my life and I will not let you tear it apart. So here's the deal. You walk away and I let you go. You stay in my life and I will destroy everything you've worked for. Your career, your reputation, your marriage. I will expose every secret you've tried to hide. The room was silent. Clara's words hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Sophie, visibly shaken, stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. You don't have to do this, Sophie stammered, but Clara could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Clara's smile remained unwavering. I already have. The consequences of betrayal. When Clara returned home, she was calm. Clara's steps echoed through the empty house as she made her way toward the door, the heavy weight of finality pressing on her chest. The decision had been made. There would be no turning back now. As she stepped into the cool evening air, she felt a wave of freedom rush over her. This was her moment, not just of escape, but of empowerment. Richard's betrayal had been the catalyst for her transformation, and now she was ready to move beyond the ashes of her past. But Clara wasn't done with her revenge, not yet. The next move. Clara had learned over the years that revenge wasn't about petty actions or rash decisions. It was about patience, precision, and strategy. The quiet moments after Richard's confession were just the beginning of her plan. She had already cut him off completely. The assets, the house, everything had been secured in her name. The divorce was just paperwork now. But there was one thing that still gnawed at her: Sophie. The young woman who had become the third link in the chain of betrayal had been quiet since their confrontation at the cafe. But Clara knew better than to trust silence. Sophie was just as capable of playing the game as Richard was. She would be expecting Clara to move on, to let the matter drop. But Clara wasn't like other women, and Sophie had underestimated her. An unexpected visitor. A few weeks passed, and life seemed to fall into its new rhythm. Clara had kept her, distance from the remnants of her old life, pouring herself into her work, her passions, and the quiet luxury she had always dreamed of. The city had become her playground, and every corner seemed to whisper possibilities. Yet, Clara couldn't escape the feeling that something was still unfinished. It wasn't until the doorbell rang one evening that Clara's thoughts were interrupted. Standing in the doorway was someone she hadn't seen in months, Elias Carrington, the detective who had once helped her with Gregory's downfall. His face, usually stoic, was etched with concern. "Clara, we need to talk," Elias said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes darted around the room, assessing the surroundings before he focused on her. "What is it, Elias?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed. His urgency was unusual, and it immediately put her on edge. "You're not going to like this," he began. "I've been looking into some things, and I've got news about Sophie." Clara's pulse quickened. "What about her?" Elias sat down, his gaze intense. "Sophie isn't just some young woman who got caught up in your marriage. She's tied to someone you didn't expect, someone who might be a bigger threat than Richard." Clara's stomach churned. Who could it be? She had never once imagined Sophie could be part of something more dangerous. "I've been digging into her background," Elias continued. Sophie has connections, serious ones. There's a man named Victor Hale. He's a financier with ties to organized crime, and he's been funding a series of illegal operations under the radar. Sophie's been involved with him for the past year. She's not just some mistress, Clara. She's playing a much deeper game. Clara sat in stunned silence as Elias's words sank in. Sophie wasn't just a betrayer. She was part of something far more dangerous, more insidious than Clara had ever imagined. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about a network of power, corruption, and deceit that reached far beyond the confines of her personal life. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Clara demanded, her voice sharp. "I didn't have all the pieces until now," Elias replied. "But I've been tracking Sophie, and I found out she's trying to tie you into Victor's network. She's looking for a way to get to you, and she might be using Richard to do it. You're not just dealing with a cheating husband anymore. You're dealing with a woman who's a liability to your safety." Clara's mind raced, the fog of betrayal clearing as a new sense of urgency set in. She had thought she had left the danger behind, but now it was knocking on her door again. She couldn't allow Sophie or anyone else into her life again. Not like this. The last play. Clara's resolve hardened. She had been in control for so long, but now the stakes had risen. This was no longer just about vengeance for her broken heart. It was about survival. Elias had been right. Sophie's ties to Victor Hale had to be severed before she could cause any more damage. But Clara wasn't going to face this challenge blindly. She would use the very tools she had honed over the years. The cunning, the patience, the power she had cultivated since the first betrayal. "Elias," Clara said, her voice unwavering, "we're going after Sophie and Victor. I'm not going to let them destroy everything I've built." Elias studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll help. But we need to be careful. Victor's not someone you want to cross without a plan." Clara stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the sleeve of her black dress. The day had come. After months of strategizing, after weeks of gathering information, she was finally prepared to make her final move. The quiet, calculated steps she had taken to dismantle Sophie's and Victor Hale's lives had worked like a charm. Now it was time for the ultimate confrontation, the one that would end everything. Her revenge would be complete. But revenge, Clara had learned, wasn't always about grand gestures or loud explosions. It was about subtlety and control, about making her mark and ensuring her adversaries would never forget the price of crossing her. The meeting with Richard Clara had deliberately kept Richard at arm's length since the divorce. But today, she would face him one last time, and it would be on her terms. The phone call had come early that morning, Richard's voice shaky, filled with desperation. "Clara, I need to see you. There's something we need to talk about. I can't go on like this." Clara's eyes had narrowed when she heard his plea. After everything he had done, after the years of betrayal, he still had the nerve to ask for her forgiveness? No. He wasn't getting that. But Clara didn't show her anger. She simply agreed to meet him at the one place he knew would break his heart, their old home. As she drove toward the property, memories of their life together flooded her thoughts, but she refused to be swayed. She had long since severed the emotional ties, and now it was about ensuring his consequences were unavoidable. The confrontation. The sun was low in the sky as Clara stepped into the house that had once been their sanctuary. She could still see the remnants of their life together. The faded photographs, the furniture that hadn't changed. But everything had shifted. Clara had already signed the final papers, and this home was no longer hers or his. It was just a place. Richard was standing near the fireplace, his back to her. But as Clara entered, he turned slowly, his face filled with a mixture of relief and shame. "You came," Richard said, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken much in the past few days. His eyes were sunken, exhausted. Clara could see the weight of his guilt pressing on him. Good. "I'm here," Clara said, her voice cool and controlled. "But don't think this is about you. This is about making sure you understand the consequences of what you've done." Richard's face twisted in confusion. "I don't understand, Clara. I'm sorry. I've made mistakes. I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But please, I want to make it right." Clara's lips curled slightly. The naive desperation in his voice made her almost pity him. Almost. She had no room for pity in her heart anymore. "No, Richard. You've lost your chance to make things right," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But let me make it clear. This is not just about me, it's about you and everything you've taken from me. You thought you could destroy me, but you've only made me stronger. You made your bed with Sophie, with Victor, with your lies. And now you'll lie in it." Richard stepped toward her, but Clara held up her hand, halting him. "No, not yet. You think you can apologize your way out of this, but you can't. You've lost your privilege to be a part of my life. I don't want to hear your excuses." She walked past him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She knew this was the part where Richard would try to convince her, where he'd beg her to reconsider. But she wasn't like other women. She had learned to never let emotions control her. Clara turned, facing him once more. "Do you really think I don't know everything? Do you think I don't know about Victor Hale's connections? About Sophie's plans to take me down? All of it. You were just a pawn in their game." Richard's face paled. His mouth opened, but he was speechless. His secrets had been exposed, the truth finally laid bare. Clara wasn't done. "You were never as clever as you thought, Richard," Clara said, her voice soft but deadly. "But I was. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your choices." The final blow. Richard's confusion deepened, but it was too late for him to change anything. Clara had already seen to that. She turned her back on him, heading toward the front door. "You've lost me, Richard, but what's worse is you've lost yourself. I've already moved on. I have everything I need now, power, control, and my freedom. You'll never have a hold over me again." Just as Clara reached the door, she stopped. She turned around slowly, watching Richard as he stood frozen, unable to speak. "Before I go," she said, her voice low and full of finality, "I should thank you, Richard. You made me realize something important. That revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about ascension. And because of you, I'll never be held down by anyone again." With that, Clara stepped outside, leaving Richard alone. Clara leaned back in the plush seat of her sleek black car, the cityscape sprawling before her as the night air hummed with quiet anticipation. The game was almost over, but there was one final piece she needed to place. A feeling of power swirled in her chest, a sensation she hadn't known she was capable of, but one that had flourished after everything she'd endured. The final step was always the hardest. A chance encounter. The phone call came just as Clara was about to leave the car and enter the quiet world she had built for herself. The voice on the other end was familiar, though she hadn't heard it in months. "Clara," Richard's voice crackled, a mixture of fear and shame coating his words. "You don't have to do this. Please. We can fix this. We can start over. I've made mistakes. I know that." Clara's lips tightened as she clenched the steering wheel. She had expected this call. Richard was nothing if not predictable in his desperation. He was a man who had seen his life unravel before him, and now, like any cornered animal, he was trying to claw his way back to some semblance of normalcy. "No," Clara replied, her voice cold and resolute. "We're done. You and I. You made your choices, Richard, and now you'll live with them." "But Clara, you don't understand." I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You took everything. You took my trust, my love, and my future. And now I'm taking it all back. You don't get to rewrite this ending, Richard. You've lost me forever." She ended the call without another word, the buzzing of her phone fading into the background. She didn't need his apology. It was too late for that. The final act of revenge. The time had come for Clara to face Sophie one last time. The young woman who had once looked up to her, admired her life, only to destroy it, was now the last piece of the puzzle. Sophie had never anticipated this moment, never dreamed that her own greed and naivety would cost her everything. But Clara was about to make sure Sophie's fall was as spectacular as it was inevitable. Clara walked into the high-end bar where she had arranged to meet Sophie. The air was thick with the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses, but Clara's focus remained singular. Sophie. She spotted her immediately, nervously fiddling with the rim of her wine glass, eyes flickering around the room. Sophie looked out of place here, much like she had when she first entered Clara's life. The moment their eyes met, Sophie froze. For a moment, she seemed to wonder if she had made a mistake in agreeing to meet Clara. But Clara knew better. Sophie had no choice. Clara took a seat opposite her, studying the younger woman's face, noting the tension in her shoulders, the shifting in her seat. Sophie had been caught, and now she knew it. "Clara," Sophie said in a voice that wavered between arrogance and fear. "What do you want from me now? I've done everything you asked. I'm out of Richard's life and I'll disappear. Just please, let me go." Clara couldn't help but smile, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a chill through Sophie. "You think I'm done with you, don't you? That's cute. But here's the thing, Sophie, you're not just a side character in this story. You're the villain, and you've been playing with fire all along. You've crossed the line." Sophie's eyes widened. "What do you mean? I've already agreed to your terms. I've gone. I'll vanish, I promise. Please, you can have everything I've done to you. I'm sorry for it." Clara leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself, Sophie. You thought you could use me, manipulate me into thinking I was the problem, but no one escapes the consequences. Not even you." Sophie's face went pale. "I don't understand." Clara stood, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "You're tangled up in a much bigger mess than you know. You see, Sophie, there's one thing you didn't anticipate. I've been tracking everything, every move, every whisper, every deal you made with Victor Hale." Sophie's breath hitched, the color draining from her face as Clara's words sank in. "I've already exposed you. I've planted the information and now there's no way out. You're tied to him, to his illegal operations, and your association with him is already circulating through the right channels. You'll be the first to go down. Not Richard, not anyone else. You." Sophie scrambled, panic filling her eyes. You can't do this. You're not like this. I thought we had a deal." Clara's smile was slow and merciless. "You thought wrong. You may have tried to manipulate me into thinking I was weak, that I couldn't survive without you or Richard. But you didn't see me for what I really am. You didn't see that I'm stronger than any of you." Sophie's shaking hands fumbled with her phone, but Clara stopped her, gripping her wrist firmly. "You can't run from this. There's no getting away now.